Day 5, April 18, 1861. Treason. Washington, D.C. and Charleston, South Carolina. The Civil War started a few hours before dawn this morning. After decades of posturing and skirmishing by politicians, citizens, and bands of thugs, two armies have actually fired up upon each other. In the 4-month gap between Lincoln's election in November 1860 and his inauguration March 1861, 7 states have left the Union. Instead of merely facing a local rebellion, the U.S. has been attacked by what some people claim to be a new nation, the Confederate States of America, which has been created to protect slave owners. Palmetto bugs. The crisis began in October 1860, a full month before Election Day, when it was clear that Lincoln had a good chance of winning. The governor of South Carolina secretly invited the governors of the other slave states to join in leaving or seceding from the Union. Most agreed to at least consider it. A few were enthusiastic. The governor of Florida replied that he was proud to say that Florida will wheel into the line with gallant Palmetto State, South Carolina's nickname, or any other caught state or states, if there is sufficient manliness at the South to strike for our rights, honor, and safety, in God's name. Let it be done before the inauguration of Lincoln. For 30 years, South Carolina had flirted seriously with secession, only to take a step back each time, largely because it might have found itself on its own. The anger reached full boil during the 1861 presidential election campaign. Politicians eager for the South to secede told voters Lincoln and his Republican Party were an immediate threat to the entire South. A lot of people were fooled. Many Southerners believed Lincoln was determined to end slavery in the existing slave states. They believed he would give full rights of citizenship to the African Americans. They also believed he wanted to use force to impose his will on them. None of that was true. Although he hated slavery, Lincoln wasn't planning on giving African Americans the full rights of citizenship, such as the right to vote. Nor was he planning to give those rights to women, who wouldn't gain them for another 60 years. Had the slave states accepted his unwavering position that slavery could not be extended into the western states, it's very possible that Lincoln would have defended the South against demands for the complete abolition of slavery. Page 60, under the photo. Lincoln with his youngest son, Thomas, known to everyone as Tad. This photo was taken on February 1865 when Tad was not quite 12 years old. He and his older brother Willie, opposite, were rarely disciplined by their parents, and they treated the White House as their own playground. When an invasion of Washington seemed likely at the beginning of the war, Tad and Willie built a fort on the roof to defend the building. They had tutors instead of attending school, and Tad's education suffered as a result. It's possible his parents were indulgent because he had many health problems. He passed away just 6 years after his father's assassination at age 18. Page 61, under the photo. Willie, Lincoln, above, was Tad's older brother by a bit more than 3 years. Although he was the oldest child in the White House, he was the third of 4 Lincoln boys. The first, Edward, had passed away shortly before turning 4. The second, Robert, was a student at Harvard University for most of his father's presidency. Willie was more disciplined and thoughtful than Tad, but still able to get into trouble. Unfortunately, in February 1862, a little after this photo was taken, Willie died of what was probably typhoid fever. He was just over 11 years old. Both his parents were inconsolable. Some observers, including the president, believe Mrs. Lincoln's mental decline after Willie's death had signs of insanity. Page 62. Lincoln was frustrated that pro-slavery politicians were misrepresenting his positions. After his election, a pro-union politician in the slave state of North Carolina asked him to make a public statement to calm people of the South. Lincoln's reply was snippy, which was unusual. "May I be pardoned," he wrote, "if I ask whether you have ever attempted to procure the reading of the Republican format, or my speeches, or by the Southern people? If not, what reason have I to expect that any additional production of mine would meet a better fate?" The departing president, James Buchanan, made the crisis worse. At the beginning of December 1860, a month after Lincoln's election, but before Buchanan left office, Buchanan attacked the long-continued and intemperate interference of the anti-slavery forces of the North, blaming them entirely for the conflict in his annual message to Congress. He did almost nothing to stop the Southern states from seceding, and several members of his cabinet, sympathetic to the slave states, worked secretly to prevent the federal government from taking action. Buchanan's defense of the South as it was preparing for secession and war has led many historians to rank him as the worst or among the worst American presidents. However, he did understand Southern sentiment. He told Congress that the greatest motivation of the South was that the North's agitation had inspired the slaves with vague notions of freedom. Hence, a sense of security no longer exists around the family altar. This feeling of peace at home has given placement to apprehensions of the servile slave insurrections. Many a matron throughout the South retires at night in dread of what may befall herself and her children before the morning. The fear that probably the greatest of all in South Carolina were slaves outnumbered free whites. Slaves were more than 57% of the state's population on the day the state seceded, December 20, 1860. Adding the small number of free blacks, the total proportion of African Americans was nearly 59%. Past attempts at uprisings had led South Carolina to enact laws preventing anyone from teaching a slave to read or write. Slaves weren't allowed to assemble in large numbers. It's worth noting that the order in which the other states seceded is almost a perfect match for the relative sizes of their slave populations and white citizens. Mississippi, the state with the second largest proportion of slaves to free white citizens, 55% slaves, was the second state to leave the Union. The next four states to leave, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, all had populations of about 45% slaves. Then came 5 states where slaves were between 25 and 33% of the population. It's possible to look at these statistics and conclude that secession was about money. Slaves equaled property, and each slave had a dollar value. The states whose economies were most dependent on slaves were the first to leave the Union, but that's only part of the story. The fear of slave uprisings that President Buchanan mentioned also explains the order in which the Southern states left. To a great extent, secession was the emotional reaction of a small ruling class who believed, possibly with good reason, that they would soon lose power and be subject to the rule of people they had treated violently. Hornet's nest. As the desire for war grew into a popular mania, Fort Sumter, sitting on an island in Charleston Harbor, became the focus of the warmongers' attention. Suddenly, it became an insult to the Southerners for the United States fort to sit at the entrance of this important southern port. The federal commander was determined to defend it. While President Buchanan was still in office, the governor of South Carolina ordered a naval blockade to put the fort under siege. Buchanan tried to send relief, but the blockade turned away from the federal ships. When Lincoln took office at the beginning of March 1861, he inherited this standoff. He recognized it as a test of his will. Although supplies were running low at the fort, the commander refused demands for surrender. To abandon the fort would be to signal his willingness to lose the South forever. After about a month in office, Lincoln decided to try again to resupply the fort. He sent the governor of South Carolina a letter in advance, promising he was sending only basic supplies to the men needed. He would not send ships or troops to break the blockade or attack the South Carolina forces. The Confederate cabinet met to discuss Lincoln's message. Instead of responding peacefully, they decided this was the moment to force the question of war. They would demand surrender at the fort, and if their demand was not met, they would attack the fort and take it by force. Under the photo, a cartoon from early 1861, soon after Fort Sumter crisis began, South Carolina Governor Francis Pickens left, is threatening President James Buchanan. He says, "Mr. President, if you don't surrender that fort at once, I'll be blowed if I don't fire." Buchanan answers, "Oh, don't, Governor Pickens, don't fire till I get out of the office." The cartoonist thinks the Southern threat will backfire. Some in the Confederate government knew this was a mistake. The Confederate Secretary of State, Robert Toombs, who had been one of the most vocal supporters of secession, said the plan to take Sumter is suicide, murder, and will lose us every friend at the North. You will wantonly strike a hornet's nest which extends from mountain to ocean, and legions now quiet will swarm out and sting us to death. It is unnecessary. It puts us in the wrong. It is fatal. He understood that the South would be at a great disadvantage in the war. It had half the population of the North, 9 million, to the North's 22 million. Factories capable of producing military equipment were mostly in the North. The business of the South was still very much to produce raw cotton, and then what was shipped to factories in the North or in the United Kingdom. Some Southern politicians believed that if war began, a few important European countries like the United Kingdom would recognize the Confederacy and give it official status as a country. In return, those countries would get valuable trading rights. But others in the South believed that the government of Europe would be cautious. To recognize the Confederacy might lead to a war with the Union. William T. Sherman, who would later become one of the most effective Union generals of the war, said to a Southern friend, "You people speak so lightly of war. You don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing. You mistake, too, the people of the North. They are a peaceful people, but an earnest people. They are not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. The Northern people not only greatly outnumber the whites of the South, but they can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or pair of shoes can you make. Only in your spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else, you are totally unprepared, with a bad cause to start with. If your people will stop and think, they must see in the end you will surely fail." In the end, however, the South was willing to fight a suicidal war to avoid living on equal terms with its slaves. Shortly after Alexander Stephens was sworn in as Vice President of the Confederate States of America, he left no doubt about this essential difference in the philosophy between the Confederacy and the U.S. The prevailing ideas entertained by Thomas Jefferson and most of the leading statesmen at the time of the formation of the old Constitution were that enslavement of the African was a violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So now on this day, not 2 months after taking office, Lincoln sees a telegram for the commander of the Union troops at Fort Sumter. Having defended Fort Sumter for 34 hours until the quarters were entirely burned, the main gates destroyed by fire, the gorge walls seriously injured, the magazine surrounded by flames, and its door closed from the effects of heat, 4 barrels and 3 cartridges of powder only being available and no provisions remaining but pork, I accepted terms of evacuation. Robert Anderson, Major 1st Artillery Commanding. This is the event that will shock the North, rally the South, and begin a conflict that will settle the slavery question. Under the photo, the rebel bombardment of Fort Sumter.